What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I'm bringing to you an analysis of the best hand traps going into the June 2018 format. I felt this is a good video because with National Season in full swing and with the WCQs right around the corner, I kind of wanted to analyze the meta and look at these hand traps in the context of that meta to kind of see what the best hand traps are looking like moving into this new format. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs today to Antonio. You are the reason that this channel is growing strong. And if you guys want to help support me in the channel through Patreon, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So before we discuss the hand traps, we need to first define the competitive meta so we kind of know what decks we're looking at in terms of these hand traps. Because without any context, we're just looking at these cards in a vacuum, and obviously some of these cards are going to be better than others, or maybe on paper they just seem like they're insane, but we need to have that context for what the decks are that we're trying to go up against. So going based off the top decks of this format, we have Sky Striker Trickstar, we have Goki, we have Pure Sky Striker, Spiral, and Altergeist. I would say that these are probably the top 5 decks that you're going to be expecting to face at any competitive event going into this format. There's surely plenty of other decks that you're going to run into as well, but I think in terms of how often or the frequency at which you're going to run into these decks, these are the top 5 we're going to be looking at in terms of this particular analysis. Now, let's go ahead and talk about these hand traps. We're just going to be going one by one in alphabetical order to kind of look at the pros and cons of each of these hand traps and see whether or not they're really viable in the context of this current format. So, starting off with Ash Blossom, naturally, because it starts with an A. Ash Blossom is looking pretty good, and you know, that shouldn't really be too much of a surprise. Ash Blossom's kind of been one of the best hand traps, you know, basically since it's been printed. I mean, last format, it wasn't the best, so it obviously has its downs, but let's take a look in this format. So, starting off with Sky Striker Trickstar, yeah, there's a lot of pretty good things you can hit in this deck. You can hit stuff like Trickstar Candina, you can hit the Light Stage, you can hit the Terraforming, you can hit the Pot of Desires, you can hit the Sky Striker Engage. I mean, I would say there's actually a lot of very viable targets for Ash Blossom to take advantage of, especially with a card like Trickstar Reincarnation, definitely acting as a very good deterrent from being hit by the Draw and Lock combo. I think Ash Blossom definitely has a very viable place here. Then taking a look at a deck like Goki, well, Goki's a bit odd because they're able to use their cards and chain block you and prevent you from ashing particular cards. One card in particular that you're really going to want to hit with Ash is Isolde, and being able to hit that very similarly to a deck like Spiral, if you're able to hit the Isolde and they're not able to get to Octo Stretch, their turn can almost realistically just end if they don't really have any other good extenders or really any good follow-up plays. So I think Ash Blossom is very vital in a matchup like that. There are going to be other cards that you're going to be able to hit when they don't have the chain blocks at their disposal, but I think Isolde is probably the prime target here. You also have a deck like Pure Sky Striker, which your options become a little bit more narrow. I mean, you could hit something like a Shizuku in the end phase. You could also hit something like just Engage. I mean, hitting Engage and they not having a single follow-up is actually really big. Now, obviously, if they have a way to get into Kagari and recur that card, you kind of went minus, but it's one of those instances where the deck can sometimes rely on Engage, and a very well-timed Ash Blossom can actually be the demise for Sky Striker. So I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. Then we have Spiral. I think Ash Blossom is an absolutely phenomenal card in this matchup. Being able to hit Spiral Double Helix can basically just end their turn, or at least know that they're not going to do anything too explosive. It also plays around Spiral Resort because Ash Blossom does not target, but you can even hit stuff like Spiral Resort in itself, and the deck does plenty of searching that Ash Blossom has a lot of viable targets. Now moving on to Altergeist. Altergeist is a bit of a weird one here because Altergeist Protocol kind of makes it a little bit difficult to evaluate a lot of these hand traps because, you know, Protocol makes it that you can't use any of them in response to any of their activations, so that's a pretty big deal. But I think out of all the hand traps we can discuss on here, Ash Blossom is probably the most effective because, you know, you can stop something like a Personal Spoofing, you can stop something like a Meluseek hitting the graveyard and getting to add something to hand. I think that's very valuable. You could also hit something like Multi-Faker, which might not be the best, but in some instances it could actually be pretty good depending on the circumstances, but it's not necessarily a card that you have a lot of very valid targets for. But I think in the context of this current meta, having to hit 4 out of 5 decks with a single hand trap are pretty good odds in my eyes. So Ash Blossom definitely looking like a very strong contender in this analysis. That moves us on to Droll and Lockbird. Now, Droll and Lockbird's a bit of a weird one, because when you look at it in the context of these decks, against Sky Striker Trickstar, the deck does a lot of searching, and you could hit something, and realistically their turn could end. They might just have a very lackluster play. Against Goki, same thing, because the deck does a lot of searching and has to, if it wants to extra link you, Droll and Lockbird can be very effective and pretty much just end their turn. Same thing goes for Pure Sky Striker. Against Spiral, it's pretty good. The deck does enough searching, especially if it's going off. The Droll and Lockbird could be effective enough. And then against Altergeist, this is one of those cards that's just completely worthless against it. But looking at these other 4 decks that Droll and Lockbird is good against, there's this stigma around Droll and Lockbird that, yeah, it's a good card and it does act as a deterrent in preventing our opponent from going off. But the thing is, even by doing that, if your deck can't really capitalize on that, then the Droll and Lockbird was pretty much just a -1, and they're gonna do everything they were able to do just on the next turn, especially if your turn is rather lackluster. I think Droll and Lockbird should only be relegated to decks that can basically just make an unbreakable board as a result of hitting their opponent with Droll, or just flat out OTKing them in general. Because let me give you an example. Let's say you're playing, a deck like Altergeist against something like Goki. If you hit them with Droll and Lockbird, okay, that's pretty cool. Now you as the Altergeist player get your turn, and you get to set a couple things up, but realistically, you didn't take anything away from them other than that first turn. And yeah, as an Altergeist player, you can set up your traps, and that could be valuable, but, Goki didn't really lose any of their advantages. Their resources are all still in their hand. They can combo off next turn, and while you have a bit more defense, now that you've had the time to set up your traps, that could be good, but in a matchup like that, that's something that might not be good enough, because Goki still might be able to power through all your back row and might just be able to kill you anyway. Say in comparison to a deck like Spiral, Spiral has a lot more OTK potential because the deck just really needs 2 Spiral monsters and it's able to OTK any opponent. So, as a Spiral player, you can Droll the Goki player, their turn ends because they don't really have anything else to do, and then you, as the Spiral player, get to combo off, OTK them. I'd say that's an effective use of Droll and Lockbird, but if you're playing something like Altergeist, like Pure Sky Striker, a slower deck that doesn't have that OTK potential, or really that unbreakable board potential, that's where a card like Droll and Lockbird might not necessarily be effective. Now again, this is just my opinion, but I feel that's kind of the double-edged sword that goes along with Droll and Lockbird. Now this moves us on to Effect Veiler. I'm going to talk about Infinite Impermanence and Effect Veiler at the same time, because even though the cards are a little bit different, they basically hit all of the same cards because they are a targeting effect negator, and so that's why I want to just kind of mold them together. Now, I'll discuss their differences in a little bit, but in the context of like Sky Striker Trickstar, the card's okay. I mean, you could hit something like a Candina, but then if they have a Licorice in hand, they can just bounce it back, and then they're still going to get the effect anyway, and then you just took a pretty hard minus. So that's not really a good example, but in the later stages of the game, when they start going into their link monsters, like maybe a Firewall Dragon or a Saryuja or something like that, I think these effect negators could prove to be very valuable. So while in the early stages of the game it might not be as good, I think there are some instances where cards like this could be rather valuable. Now against Goki, these effect negators are actually very valuable because these cards don't care about chain blocking. Basically, at any point in the chain, these cards can be activated and they can negate the particular card that's going to be the source of the problem. And worst case scenario, they can also negate the Firewall Dragon, which is going to help them establish their extra link, and that's going to be a very crippling play there. So I think these effect negators are particularly good against Goki. Against Sky Striker, it's a bit iffy. I mean, I know the OCG plays Effect Veiler at 3 or even like 2 to 3 in most of their decks, but you're kind of only just getting a good 1-for-1 at best. I mean, you could stop something like Kagari from adding back and engage. You can add, stop a Shizuku from adding something in the end phase, but realistically, that's kind of the best you're going to get out of it, and depending on the situation, that could be very, that could just be incredible, because if they don't have access to another engage, that can just completely cripple their play away entirely, it's not necessarily the best because I think in a grind game like that, those cards and that deck is really just going to out-resource you anyway, and using a card like that is kind of inefficient. So that's just my take on that. Moving on to Spiral. Spiral's a bit of a tough one because while these cards can be very good, Spiral Resort is a very big threat. And since both of these cards target, Spiral Resort protects them from targeting, meaning if they have a double Helix and you're just stuck with Valor and Impermanence in your hand, well, double Helix is going to resolve and it's not going to be a good time. Now, you can still use these cards on stuff like Unicorn or basically any non-Spiral monster, or if they don't have the Resort up to protect their double Helix, then these cards can be very good. But Resort kind of limits the potential that these cards might have, and that's something to be very wary of. And then Altergeist, again, you're really not going to get any value off of this. I mean, you could hit something like, I don't know, a Marionetter, maybe, I don't know, like maybe a Multi-Faker, but I just, again, the hand traps are not particularly good against Altergeist because Protocol is also something you really have to worry about. So, I mean, when you look at the effect negation between Valor and Impermanence, Impermanence has a lot more pluses. I mean, it's a trap, which means it can't be stopped by Called by the Grave. It also has the added value of being able to negate spells and traps, so that's pretty good if you set it. So I think there's an argument to be made either way, and plus, neither of them is once per turn, so if you open multiples, there's an advantage there, but it's kind of hard to weigh whether or not these cards are good enough to play in this current metagame, just because they're kind of adequate at best. I would say it's probably the best in the Goki matchup, but effect negation is kind of one of those things that can be valuable when it does come up. And this moves us on to Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion. People are very polarized about a card like this because some people just absolutely love it and swear it's the best hand trap in the game, and other people just absolutely hate it, and so I think this will be a good point of discussion. So, starting off with Sky Striker Trickstar, there aren't really a lot of good targets against this deck. I mean, you could hit something like Kagari from adding Engage back to hand, or even Hornet Bit. There's also stuff like Trickstar Reincarnation, which I think that's pretty valuable. Being able to hit Reincarnation from being able to resurrect something, I think is just a very good boon for any deck looking to kind of go in and OTK a deck like this, but there aren't really a ton of really good targets for a card like this, so it's kind of so-so at best. Goki's another deck where this card is kind of so-so. I mean, being able to hit a card like Goki Rematch can be very effective and can stop their plays from going just completely off, but there are kind of these instances where it's not going to stop a ton of very valuable cards. I think in that deck, being able to stop something like Called by the Grave could be a viable reason to play Ghost Bell, because since the deck is so combo-centric and they're very scared of hand traps, they're going to be maxing out on Called by the Grave, and since Ghost Bell can negate Called by the Grave, meaning your hand trap will be able to stop them and basically just put an end to their plays, I think that's where Ghost Bell really shines. Against pure Sky Striker, the card doesn't really do a whole lot. I mean, the deck doesn't do a ton of recursion from the graveyard aside from Kagari, which could be good just depending on the circumstance, but I think that's not exactly wide enough of a reach in terms of how applicable the card can really be. Against Spiral, I will say the card is very powerful because it's basically like your 4th, 5th, and 6th copies of Ash Blossom, since it's another card that can stop double Helix without necessarily being a card like Ash Blossom, so that means you can kind of get 2 uses in one, and I think that's pretty good. There's also a lot of cards that trigger in the graveyard with Spiral and are basically doing things like that, so I think that's pretty good. And then against Altergeist, again, you know, you could hit maybe a Manifestation if you're lucky, but Protocol is also a big concern, so I don't really think it's too good. I want to reiterate with Ghost Bell that one of the big things here is that Ghost Bell can hit cards that not a lot of other cards really can. I mean, being able to hit that Goki Rematch, hit that Monster Reborn, hit that Soul Charge, and again, Called by the Grave is a very good card for you to hit with Ghost Bell to ensure that your hand traps are going to go through and pretty much thwart your opponent's plays. So that's pretty much where the value of a card like this lies, but against the overall context of the meta, I don't necessarily think, in my opinion, it's the strongest card, but it does have its uses. Now this moves us on to Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, something that people would argue was probably the best hand trap of last format because Pendulum was the best deck, but let's see if that's the case now. Going up against Sky Striker Trickstar, Trickstar was kind of the matchup last format that if you were playing Ogre, it was kind of just a dead card, because there really isn't anything too good that you can hit with Ogre, apart from like maybe a light stage activation from targeting one of your set cards. But that's kind of really it. I mean, you could risk trying to hit a Candina if they don't have a Licorice, but again, that's just as bad as trying to use Effect Veiler, and they're still going to get the search anyway. It just removes the monster from the board. So, not the best in that matchup. Against Goki, it's not too good because they can chain block and protect their monsters. I will say the one instance it is good against Goki is to hit Firewall Dragon if they can't chain block it, because if you can remove Firewall Dragon in that instance, that's going to definitely slow them down from being able to assemble a massive board. Against Pure Sky Striker, it's not really that good, but there's another really good card that you can hit in Sky Striker Multi-Roll. If you can hit Multi-Roll and prevent them from just setting all of their resources in their back row, that's really, really good. But the big question is that worth playing Ogre just so you can hit that one card? That's kind of the question a lot of people are weighing and going back and forth on. Against Spiral, Ghost Ogre's kind of okay. I mean, you can hit something like Helix, and while they can still add something like Sleeper, it's kind of going to slow them down enough that you know you're probably not going to die that turn. And then you can also hit stuff like Resort, because Resort is at 1, so you know you can pretty much safely hit that if that's the only copy in the game. And then once again against Altergeist, you know, the hand traps aren't really too good, so we're not really even going to talk about it. Ogre has really fallen out of favor, especially when you look at it in the context of these decks, but you know, that's okay. There are instances where Ogre can shine, but realistically, is it going to come up enough that Ogre's going to be relevant? That's really the question you have to ask yourself. Now this brings us on to Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. Now against Sky Striker Trickstar, Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries isn't too good. I mean, there aren't really any Silver Bullet cards in the extra deck to hit against this deck to kind of just pretty much win the game outright. I mean, at best, you could hit something like a Borlo Dragon or a Firewall Dragon to stop the OTK. I'd say that's probably your best option, or maybe something they might just make off of Scapegoat, but it's really inoptimal in those instances. However, against a deck like Goki or even Spiral, you can just hit stuff like Isolde or even Double Helix, and that can just completely cripple the deck entirely, and that's where a card like Ghost Reaper really shines. The decks can be kind of reliant on these cards. Hell, you can even hit Firewall if you really just want to stop them from abusing that, but I think hitting stuff like Isolde and Double Helix is the better call. Against Pure Sky Striker, hitting something like Kagari or even Shizuku can be a huge swing in terms of advantage, because by denying their ability to recurse resources from the graveyard, or just keep adding cards from their deck to their hand, you're really going to slow down their ability to generate and recur advantage, and in a deck that is highly dependent on having the majority of card advantage in the matchup, I think that can be a very good card in particular. And then against Altergeist, again, you can hit Hextia to maybe prevent getting OTK'd, but realistically, the deck doesn't really need Hextia to win. They usually just make Hextia if they're in a win more position anyway, so it can come up, but I don't really think it's relevant. Now, while Ghost Reaper isn't necessarily the best against the most represented deck of the format, being able to hit the Isolde for Goki, the Double Helix for Spiral, and the Kagari or the Shizuku for your Sky Striker matchup, hitting 3 out of the top 4, or I guess top 5 rather, is a very good card and something you definitely might want to consider in either the main or the side deck. Now, last but not least, we're going to talk about Psyframe Gear Gamma. Now, Gamma's a bit of a weird one because it negates effects and destroys monsters, but I don't think that's necessarily where the role of this card lies. I think where the role rests is the fact that this card can negate hand traps very similarly to Called by the Grave, but you also have the advantage of playing a card that you can use going second to slow your opponent down if you absolutely have to. Against a deck like Sky Striker Trickstar, there aren't really many good targets. Again, you're kind of falling into the situation with the effect negators. Now, the nice thing is, even if they bounce Candina back to hand, at least you'll still negate the effect. It's just kind of going to be a little bit awkward to go from there. I guess you could stop stuff like Saryuja or maybe even Firewall if you have to. That's assuming you have no monsters on your field, but that's a big if, and it isn't something that might not come up enough. Now, against Goki, again, Goki can just chain block a lot of these instances to protect you from the Gamma. Hitting Firewall if they can't chain block it, I think, is probably the best example here, but again, that's really something that you have to really hope that the Goki player can't play around. Against Pure Sky Striker, you could main Gamma in your Pure Sky Striker deck to possibly prevent your opponent from using hand traps like Ash Blossom or Droll and Lockbird, since the deck is primarily spell heavy and it has a lot of spell cards that are going to bait those hand traps. But against the deck itself, again, sure, you can maybe hit something like Kagari or Shizuku, but is that going to be enough? I don't necessarily think so. Against Spiral, it can be pretty good. I mean, again, hitting double Helix or hitting any of just the monsters is pretty valuable. You can also use it in Spiral, since Spiral does have a slew of spells that are going to be able to bait hand traps, like 1-for-1, Spiral Resort, all these other types of things, and that way you can just pretty much negate the hand traps, get an Omega for your troubles, and that's pretty good. And then lastly, against Altergeist, again, Gamma's pretty much worthless. So again, I think Gamma's kind of in this role where if you're playing a deck trying to go first and you want to have that hand trap negation, but you also want to have the flexibility of having a card that can go second and slow down your opponent if need be, that's kind of the role that Gamma falls in. It doesn't necessarily come up as a card to just counter your opponent's plays. It's more so just a flexible card that you can use in either instance, but you do have to remember that you have to play that Psy-Frame driver, and that can be a bit of a liability. So guys, that's gonna do it for this hand trap analysis. I know this video was a little bit long, so thank you so much for sticking in there with me. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about these hand traps moving into this format. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.